Well, another fascinating tech talk, and a reminder of the huge breadth of knowledge and research and information which architects need to absorb these days to get the best out of their own projects. And Jeremy, I'm reminded actually from something about all the sessions today, and indeed many of the sessions that we've heard over the last 2 days, about the significance of one of our award programs called the WAFEX Awards. Now, we founded this in 2017. What were the intentions of it?
The intentions of it were to create another tier of recognition of architectural thinking at WAF. I mean, obviously, the main awards programs celebrates individual projects, whether they're built or unbuilt, whether they're interiors, whether they're landscape or buildings. And of course, that is the greatest manifestation of architectural creativity, I think. But we also wanted to find a way of recognizing some of the key issues with which architects have to grapple. So for our 10th, wasn't quite our 10th anniversary, but for the 10th festival in 2017, we created this program of 10 key points, key subjects, which we think are going to be the defining issues of architecture over the next 10 years. And I think, we've made one or two adjustments to that, but lots of that has been proved to be more or less correct. And I think in particular, this last presentation brings back the enormous influence of digital technologies, which is one of our awards.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to read out the 10 because I think those of you who've been looking at the sessions this morning will see how many of these have crossover with what we've seen and heard. The first one, an obvious one in a way, was climate, energy and carbon. We had water and food, aging and health, reuse, or retrofit, as sometimes called, smart city technology, building technology, cultural identity, ethics and values, power and justice, and virtual worlds. And of course, the tech presentation we've just seen is certainly an example of the virtual worlds, but it also, I suppose, is kind of morphing into building technology also, because the way that we're conceiving designs is in turn influencing the way that construction technologies are brought into place to deliver the final product.
I think this came home in James Pickard's presentation a couple of days ago, where he mentioned the work that he and his firm, Cartwright Pickard, have been doing on 7D BIM, which allows a whole virtual model of a building to be built and tested, not just to be used to show the client what the client's getting, or planning authorities or the public what might be built on a particular site, but also to test its performance, to simulate its performance, and therefore to try and design out or to iron out at the design stage potential flaws. Now, of course, that will have an enormous impact on the quality of buildings.
We've certainly come a long way since 25 years ago when a program called SimCity was all the rage. And I suppose it looks pretty dated now, but the instincts and aspirations behind it very much in tune with the sort of games modeling kind of ideology is not the right word, but the kind of games modeling approach to the built environment. It is a form of a game, except that it has very real physical outcomes. And I suppose the Water Prize winners this morning, they address a number of those WAFEX subjects. Clearly, it's affecting climate, energy, and carbon because it's about heat reduction in buildings. It has to do, obviously, with water. It has to do with reuse, because one could imagine that the reduction of heat on the facades of buildings will probably make those facades last much longer. And it also has to do with building technology and reuse and retrofit. So quite often we find that we should say that the WAFEX Awards are strictly for future projects. So these are things that are envisioning futures rather than things that have already been delivered. But we quite often see crossover between one thing and another, including the slightly more abstract subjects of ethics and values and power and justice.
Absolutely. I think, solving issues like sustainability have a very strong ethical dimension to them. But also, architects like to think of themselves as pioneers in solving some of the big social problems, such as quality of housing, or quality of healthcare, or the quality of education, all of which come under ethics and values. And I think power and justice is something which manifests itself in all sorts of different ways, but very particularly in the urban environment, that the way surveillance might be carried out, the way policing might be carried out, is very strongly a function of the sort of spaces and the sort of uses that we put in those spaces that we create.
And those sorts of, let's say, ethics and values applicable to architects and architecture as much as to society in general, have actually formed the subject matter for some of our festivals. What are the values, for instance, by which architects generally undertake their education? What are the values they hold in the design and delivery of projects? But then also, what is the value, both in financial and environmental terms, of what it is that architects do?
Yes, and of course, the very crude models of value that are typically applied to buildings, which are, on the whole, purely financial and purely at a particular moment. Buildings tend to last quite a long time, decades certainly, rather than years, if not centuries. And what we lack are really effective tools of measuring the value over the life of a building, which I think is becoming incredibly important. And indeed, possibly over the materials which might be reused. I mean, reuse is not just about reusing an existing building, it might be about reusing materials in a different building or in a different way. And we saw that in the presentation by Almanac about schools, where they took the materials that had been used in the pavilion at the Dulwich Picture Gallery and showed how they could be adapted to make planters in school playgrounds, which, as Melanie Mortimer, one of their school clients, pointed out, had huge effects on the opportunities for using the playground for the students in the schools.
I think this is a point that Mario Cucinella made in his lunchtime talk yesterday, which is, firstly, at one level, longevity equals sustainability. If the building's around for a hell of a long time, then provided you've designed it reasonably well, then the cost in use will diminish and the embodied carbon remains embodied, and the longer it remains embodied, the better it is. However, he pointed to the enormous amount of CO2 which is generated as a result of, firstly, a decision to make a building in the first place, and then secondly, the use of materials and how they're manufactured and the construction itself. And he was suggesting that the profession, and he's dipped his toe in the water here, should get more engaged in the methodologies of construction, the effect or possible effect of robotics, and the way one can minimize everything from travel to site to the manufacture of the materials themselves.
And of course, digital technologies are making it much more possible for architects to become involved in the manufacturing process. And again, this is a point that has come out in a number of ways, that the future of construction will have to be through digitized design and digitized production, which is really a continuation of the curve which started in the 80s of things like just-in-time delivery and the forms of project management that were introduced, certainly in the UK, around the creation of very large buildings in the wake of the Big Bang, which meant that the whole of the City of London had to transform itself. But of course, that was pretty crude. That was analog, whereas what we're talking about now is digital. And I think the power of the digital engines, like the Twin Motion we were seeing just now from Epic Games, is that it allows you to look into the future in a way the analog technology really didn't, other than through orthogonal drawings.
I think that Robert Adam made a good point when he cited that old remark about the most sustainable building is one that already exists. And this question of sustainability, a highly political and politicized issue. There's a great debate going on in London at the moment about whether architects who signed up to Architects Declare, which was an environmental manifesto, can they remain part of the manifesto group if, for example, they design airports? And, I see from the news feeds that Foster and Partners have decided to withdraw from Architects Declare. I think this is not a simple issue. I remember a presentation at World Architecture Festival, I think last year, certainly in Amsterdam, by Grimshaw and Andrew Wally, where he posed the question of, well, which industry do you think is likely to be more effective at heading to zero carbon with technologies that we can only guess at currently? Do you think it might be aviation, which took us to running about and flapping our arms in the air in the mid-19th century, to landing a man on the moon in 1969? Or do you think it would be construction? And I think this is a very, very serious point, because even with moves towards zero carbon buildings, as Mario Cucinella pointed out yesterday, the expectation is that in the next 40 years, we're basically going to repeat the square meterage of buildings that exists on Earth. We're going to double it. I think that puts questions about whether you design airports into some sort of context, and is certainly going to raise the issue of smart city technology. How are we going to cope, especially if we're living in more distanced environments, with a huge population growth and hugely denser cities?
Well, we almost have to think of buildings as being not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And in a sense, we should be thinking about cities as replacing the functions of the rainforest. We can't substitute the rainforest for all sorts of reasons. But if we accept that the likelihood, the reality is, sadly, that it will probably be diminished, and we might regret that, we might even try to stop it or slow it. But really, if we can think of buildings as being carbon negative, then we can turn these growing conurbations into huge carbon sinks. And I think that's what we really need to be aiming for, because, of course, that would do much more benefit in the long run than limiting the number of flights we take.
And I must say, I think our experience at the festival has been coloured by the 4 years we spent in Singapore, because even during that brief time, we saw a huge advance in thinking and delivery of what used to be called bioclimatic architecture, invented by Ken Yang in a Malaysian context 3 or 4 decades ago, but now brought into being in a very significant way, and also via regulation. Because I think it's one of the great aspects of Singaporean architecture is that the notion that the building should not take any more from the ground or from the space it sits on, its bit of the planet, that it should give it back. Hence, the calculations of supplying more than 100% of site cover through terraces and rooftops, which can, of course, be planted out. And this seems to be a growing trend, and not just in tropical climates either.
Well, I remember one of the presentations in Singapore by the late, very much lamented Michael Sorkin, where he presented the project he had been working on for how Manhattan could feed itself by growing things. And Manhattan, of course, is not a tropical climate. In many ways, it's quite an extreme climate, from very hot summers to very cold winters. And even though it was difficult, I think, for Manhattan, by using its facades and roofs to grow everything it needed, you could significantly reduce the footprint from which food would have to come in to feed it. And I think that's one of the things one of the things we're hoping to do with the manifesto is to get people to think on a big scale about these really big issues, because in the end, as the late Charles Moore, the great postmodernist architect, said that design is a key to solve some of the world's biggest problems. Now, architects are not the only designers, of course. Architecture isn't the only design method. But it would be one of the routes to solving the problem that architects always lament, which is that they're pushed to the back of the queue when it comes to decision making, whether it's over finance or politics or whatever. If they can show that the core of their practice, i.e. design, is a route to solving some of these really big problems, then architects will move way up the feeding chain. That's one of the discussions we hope to initiate with the manifesto.
Yeah, the WAFEX manifesto specifically had in mind that at that time we were looking over the next 10 years, so 10 subjects, 10 years, that the issues that have been identified will be ones where definitely architects could and should take a lead, and I think it has started to happen. I mean, I remember Michael Sorkin in his rather laconic Manhattan way saying, it could mean the death of the New York strip sirloin if his ideas were put into effect. But that sort of provocative thinking about, well, if that's what it takes, maybe in 50 years' time, that's what it will be. On the same sort of wavelength, I guess, Rahel Balaciu-Law from Sweden made a brilliant presentation of something I think jurors weren't quite sure if it was serious or not, but I think it was absolutely serious, which was essentially a breeding farm for insects, which would then be turned into protein. And it was delivered with great architectural finesse and rigor, and at the time reminded me of those sort of student projects from yesteryear of sort of fish farms and hydroponics, which all seem kind of way out, but actually are now happening. And as Vicente Guallart showed, all too briefly, but he did show it in his master plan projects for residential mixed-use developments in China, that idea of farms on the roof is alive and well.
Absolutely, and we live in an era of great gastronomic innovation by people like the restaurant in Barcelona or other places where the most unlikely raw materials are being used and made into extremely tasty food. Now, we don't all want to eat insects, as anyone who has watched, which I have to say I haven't, but I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where various people who we might have heard of are forced to eat bugs, and they generally don't really like the experience. What we need is to harness the creativity of these leading chefs into making those things palatable. And that is the key to sustainability, as Rahel Balaciu-Law pointed out.
I think it's quite noticeable that the relationship between really advanced culinary thinking in architecture is really quite a strong one. I'm thinking about the El Bulli restaurant and the work they've done, the work that 3XN have done with
MoMA in Copenhagen. Absolutely. Yeah.
And it seems a sort of fecund subject. My theory has always been that architects, in a sense, see themselves as chefs. Many of them like to cook. And I think one of the reasons for that, to end on in this little conversation on a slightly frivolous note, not entirely frivolous, is that, of course, the work that architects do is long-term work. It takes an awful long time for almost any concept to actually become reality. And of course, it involves huge amounts of collaboration. On the other hand, if an architect wants to make dinner for the family or for friends, they can have complete control over every aspect of it. They can write the menu, they can do the shopping, they can work to a budget that they preset themselves, they can choose the wine, they can choose the cutlery, they do the mise en place. They're in complete control over the cooking process and cycles. They can use the latest technologies, and they can kind of do it more or less unaided. And the great difference between cooking dinner and making a building is, of course, that in the case of the dinner, if it all goes hideously wrong, you write it off to experience and you can try it again the next day. Alas, with the building, all you can do, as the old joke has it, is if it's not so great, use landscape.